The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the podcast, its host, or sponsors. If you would like to discuss the murder in your family on this podcast, please be sure to visit themurderinmyfamily.com for more information. You can support this podcast by visiting patreon.com/themurderinmyfamily. This episode may contain unsettling material or subject matter. Listener discretion is advised.
Thank you for joining me for episode 47 of The Murder in My Family. If you find that you enjoy this podcast, please take a minute to rate and review it wherever you listen to your podcast, so that the show can continue to grow and reach new listeners. To learn more about the show or the cases we discuss, please visit themurderinmyfamily.com. You can also find us on Twitter with the handle @MurderInMyFam, or by searching for the Murder in My Family podcast on Facebook. If you'd like to support this show through a Patreon donation, it's always appreciated, and you can do so by visiting patreon.com/themurderinmyfamily. Benefits of supporting the show on Patreon include early access to ad-free episodes of the show, plus bonus content not heard in regular episodes. Support may also include thank you cards, stickers, and more. If you prefer to, you can also support the show through a PayPal donation by visiting paypal.me/themurderinmyfamily. In each episode, I'll give shoutouts to any new supporters. And thank you to all of the supporters that generously donate to help keep the show growing and improving. One thing I wanted to mention before we get started with today's case is that I'll be a guest co-host on the Parcast show, Today in True Crime. You can hear that episode coming up on November 6th, and you can find it wherever you listen to your podcast. So now with all that out of the way, let's get into this episode. On October 28th, 1966, 53 years ago to the week before this episode is being published, a young wife and mother was brutally beaten, raped, and murdered by an unknown killer. On that fateful night, her killer also severely beat her 18-month-old son, but he survived. The case is still unsolved, and 5 decades later, the question remains, who killed Anita Taylor? Anita was born Anita Eileen Huffenberger in Springfield, Ohio on November 25, 1945, to Atmore and Elizabeth Huffenberger. She had 2 sisters, 1 half-brother, and 2 half-sisters. During high school, Anita met Larry Taylor, and the two started dating. Larry had recently moved to nearby South Charleston, Ohio. He would walk back and forth to Anita's house in Springfield nearly every day to see her. Larry and Anita graduated from Southeastern High School in South Charleston in 1963, and the couple married in 1964. They were one of 3 couples in their graduating class who eventually got married. Larry and Anita rented a small 2-bedroom home located at 415 Ludlow Avenue in Springfield, Ohio. On April 27, 1965, the couple's one and only child was born, a son they named Aaron Lee. Life for the young family was good, but Anita decided she needed a job so they could save to buy a house of their own. In the fall of 1966, Anita applied for a job at Springfield Public Finance. More than 9 women applied for the same position, and Anita knew some of those candidates from school. Of all the applicants, Anita had the least experience. Regardless, she was rewarded with the job, but she couldn't quite understand how she was selected over the more qualified applicants. The man who hired her was Ellsworth Miller, her supervisor. Shortly after Anita started the job, she noticed that Ellsworth followed her home every night. When Anita asked him why he followed her home, he said it was to make sure she got there safely. But something about this must have made her uncomfortable, because she told her mother about it on more than one occasion. Anita's husband, Larry, worked second shift at Robbins & Myers Incorporated, a manufacturing firm located on Lagonda Avenue in Springfield, and he carpooled with a couple of guys he worked with, Morton Smith and Eddie Bartley. Springfield was a decent-sized town with a population between 81,000 and 82,000 in the mid-1960s, but it was relatively safe. But despite this, while Larry was at work, Anita made sure to lock all the doors so she could feel as safe as possible. Around this time, a series of murders was happening 75 miles away in Cincinnati, which made Anita feel uncomfortable at home alone with her baby. Perhaps her uneasiness was some sort of premonition of what was about to happen. On October 28, 1966, Larry returned home from work at around 1:50 a.m. He walked up to the front door and knocked on it so Anita could let him in, but she didn't answer. He could hear the television on in the living room and what sounded like someone moaning in the bedroom. He forced the door open and found Anita lying on the floor of their bedroom. She had been brutally beaten and raped. Anita tried speaking to Larry, but she couldn't get the words out due to blood in her throat. Larry quickly looked around the house to make sure the attacker wasn't still there, and he found it empty. Without hesitating, Larry ran to Bill's Cafe located at 1640 Sheridan Avenue, where his carpool buddies were having a drink. He asked the guys for help, barely able to speak. The police were called, and all three men rushed back to the Taylor home. The fire division, emergency squad, and Springfield Police Captain Francis Schaefer soon arrived at the scene, but none of the people there were prepared for what awaited them. When they entered the home, they found Anita lying on the bedroom floor on the west side of the bed, with her feet to the north and head to the south. She was barely alive and moaning softly. Her face had been badly beaten and her throat crushed. A shoe imprint was visible on her throat. The weapon used in the beating was later said to be a broken soda bottle that caused several lacerations on Anita's face, and she was nude from the shoulders down. Her bra and blouse were pulled up around her neck, and her shorts and underwear were on the floor next to her. The officers then went to the baby's bedroom, which was located on the northwest corner of the house. That's where they found little Aaron laying in his crib. He too had been severely beaten. The back door of the house was ajar, but there were no signs of forced entry or any signs of a struggle. A size 8.5 or 9 bloody footprint was found, as well as a partial fingerprint on a light bulb on the back porch. Police believe the killer threatened to harm Aaron or had beaten the child in front of Anita to keep her quiet. Police guessed that the crime most likely took place a short time before Larry arrived home. The emergency squad transported Anita and Aaron to the community hospital, where unfortunately, Anita was pronounced dead on arrival. Aaron had a broken left leg and several bruises, but would survive the beating. Clark County Coroner Dr. George P. Anderson arrived at Community Hospital and took charge of Anita's body to perform the autopsy. Dr. Anderson reported that Anita's death was caused by aspiration of the blood into the lungs, which was a result from the killer stomping on her neck. Essentially, Anita drowned on her own blood. Sole and heel marks were found on her face and neck. Dr. Anderson also reported that Anita's attack could have happened up to 4 hours before her death. Sergeant Marvin Titer and Patrol Officer Richard Powell of the Bureau of Identification collected evidence from the Taylor home and sent a total of 27 bags to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation in London, Ohio for testing. The contents included all of Anita's clothing, scrapings from Anita's fingernails, and hair samples. Police questioned neighbors and suspicious people who police thought might be connected to the crime, but that led nowhere. Everyone who knew the couple had nothing but good things to say about them. Police had no idea about a possible motive for the killing, but based on the scene, they felt the attack was obviously sexual in nature. Not long after Anita's murder, an anonymous donor offered a reward of $500 for information leading to the arrest of Anita's killer. Eventually, the reward increased to $2,000 after Anita's mother and husband each donated $500, in addition to a donation made by a second anonymous donor. But the reward didn't lead to an arrest. On November 2nd, 1966, a woman named Betty Falls was beaten to death. A 30-year-old man named Richard Clark was charged in her murder. Springfield police looked to see if there was a connection between the murders. but the police chief said the crimes weren't connected. No one was ever arrested or charged in Anita Taylor's murder. Her son Aaron was raised by Anita's parents. Because of his injuries, he had to learn to walk again. His father, Larry Taylor, eventually remarried and had 2 more sons, Michael and Jared, and a daughter named Leslie, who passed away in 2018. Larry had little contact with Aaron after Anita's murder, only seeing him a couple times a year. When Aaron was only 13, his father died in a motorcycle accident. Larry was only 33 years old at the time of his death. Anita's father passed away in November 1978. Her mother, Elizabeth, died in March of 2008. Anita's parents went to their graves, never knowing who savagely murdered their daughter. Just a quick side note. If this case sounds at all familiar to listeners, it may be because it's eerily similar in many ways to the murder of Madeline D. Filippi, whose case we covered in episode 29 of The Murder in My Family. If you haven't listened to that episode, you may want to do that at the conclusion of this episode. Anita's son, Aaron Taylor, is now in his 50s and has no memory of the attack, but that hasn't stopped him from trying anything at all to summon up memories of the horrible day back in October of 1966. He's even tried hypnotism to try and bring some of those memories back. Aaron continues to search for answers in his mother's murder, and he joined me to discuss the case and his search for justice. That conversation is coming up momentarily. Hi, Aaron, and thanks for joining me to discuss your mom Anita's case with us.
How you doing, Mike? I appreciate the opportunity to come on and talk about it.
The first thing I wanted to talk about right from the beginning is you've been on a long journey to find your mom's killer, a 50-plus year journey that started with you being injured in the attack on your mom. How hard has this journey been for you and your family?
With me, it's kind of strange. I was 18 months old when it all happened. Ironically, right after I was injured in the attack as well. But when I came out of the hospital just a few months later, I can actually remember bits and pieces of that. So it's a little frustrating for me because I don't remember the actual incident. But I do remember things from just a couple of months afterwards. So that's a little strange. And for me, so for me, it was, I didn't know her. That doesn't make it any easier. Don't ever let people tell you that you can't miss something that you never had. That's straight out not true. But it's strange watching people around me. Definitely my grandmother, her mother, who her mother and father raised me from roughly 18 months old until I left for college. So watching them was sometimes difficult. I always wanted to ask questions about Mom when I was younger, and my grandmother would just, would always end up with her crying. So it was kind of, well, I guess I won't do that. And so I didn't really ask a lot of questions. But that was, the hardest part was watching how it impacted everyone, in the family around me. For me, it was, I didn't really know her. I don't think I carried a whole lot of anger about it. I probably do and don't realize it. But it's pretty, it's frustrating to not have any memories. But the biggest thing was just you watch the people around you and how they react, and the topic comes up or something will happen on the television or Halloween rolls around, which is roughly the anniversary of her murder. And people in my family aren't really fond of Halloween anymore. So watching everyone else around the family and even friends and growing up and those family members, when they find out who you are, it's a little strange to watch their reaction.
So let's start back at the beginning. Your family was living in the Springfield, Ohio area. You were just a baby. Your mom was home taking care of you. Your dad was at work trying to support the family. And in October of 1966, an intruder came in. Obviously, you said you have some vague memories of the aftermath of that, but how have you been able to piece together, or what is your the account as you know it, as you've been able to put together of what happened that day?
Yeah, that's kind of part of my frustration is that the case is still open, And so my attempts to get, all of the hard and fast actual evidence and what we have and don't have has been difficult. But as I understood it, no forced entry into the house. She was basically beaten to death. Her throat was stepped on. And that's what, it sounds like that's what the final, really the death blow was that. She was found in a state of somewhat undress. I think she was nude from basically the neck to the knees, basically. The long and the short is she choked on her own. She basically aspirated, choked on her own blood. There was a footprint that was in her blood. Walking away from the scene, it was a fairly small print, if I recall. It was like a size 8.5. So it was fairly small print. We've gone back and to my understanding, there is some partial DNA that was taken from we just had it tested here a couple of years ago. And they did get a little bit of, I'm not sure how that works as far as, a partial hit, but they have been able to pull some DNA from the crime scene some 50 years later. So, but I was beaten, but found in my crib. So it was one of those. The neighbors didn't hear anything. So I might, if you try to piece together what probably happened was, I'm guessing someone comes in, grabs me, and starts tossing me around, and Mom was very protective, and she was, from all that I understand, a very good mom, and probably just said, hey, just leave him alone, and do whatever you need to do, which is why I was found in my crib, but I had a broken leg. So, and then my dad actually came home from work and actually found both of us there. So that I'm sure that was a very strange thing for him. But I did actually talk to one of the guys that he rode to work with, and that's just been a few years ago. And even 50 years later, when I knocked on their door, which I was unannounced, I asked if he was home, and his wife wanted to know who I was. And I gave her my name, and she just immediately kind of went white and just said, are you Larry and Anita's boy? And that's 50 years later. So it was, people definitely remember it. There's no question. And I did ask him a few questions about, coming into that crime scene, and he, 50 years later, the guy starts kind of breaking down a little bit. And I can only imagine that was a pretty horrific scene. So.
And you can only imagine how your father walking in on it must have felt as well.
No, yeah, we never, it's very strange. I don't know how other families deal with this type of a situation, but it really wasn't talked about that much. I don't remember ever having a conversation with my dad, other than a brief, like a sentence. The last time I saw him, which he was killed in a motorcycle wreck when I was 13. So the last time I saw him was, Christmas when I was 12. So that's 1977. And the only thing he ever said was, that I loved your mother. And I said, yeah. And he just, he mentioned he was a suspect, which he should have been a suspect. That's usually the way. That's usually the person that is involved in it is probably the spouse. But he, went on to say, yeah, I was a suspect for a while, and I was at work, and that entire conversation was about 30 seconds, and that's the one and only time we ever talked about it. So,
wow. And you mentioned that police investigation. It sounded like they had some things to work with and some evidence early on. Can you tell by what you've researched and looked into how well a job they did investigating the scene right after the murder?
I think they did a good enough job as far as trying to get evidence from the crime scene. I think they were focusing on my father, and they weren't really spending enough time trying to find who actually did it. To be honest, I don't think that it was handled in the best fashion. Even now, I've been given false information. A lot of times I think that they just want to get rid of me, and that's probably not going to happen. But there was quite a bit of evidence that was taken. Everything from carpet samples to furniture to my bedclothes, my mother's clothes. I've been told that there was over 20 boxes of evidence that was taken. I was also told later that they had more or less they'd lost some of the evidence because they changed locations, and some of the evidence was, quote, misplaced. So it's a little frustrating when you try to get information, and I've just been kind of running into brick walls here and there. So,
did they have any suspects, as far as you know, besides your father early on?
That's one of the things I've tried to find out is, who was a suspect, who was questioned. I think there were a few people that were brought in for questioning, but there was an old boyfriend that I think was brought in for questioning. We were always very curious about her boss at the time, and I'm not even sure that he was ever questioned. I went through the file at one point, and quite a lengthy, written dissertation of who was questioned and what was taken from the crime scene and what the thoughts were, who was talked to, but no mention of him. So really, I saw some names here and there that looked familiar, but to be honest, I don't know exactly who was questioned, who was cleared. I've gone as far as track down the paper boy. That was in North Carolina, so I drove all the way to North Carolina just to knock on his door. And super nice guy. Pretty clear that he didn't have any idea of what went on. But yeah, I really don't know. I know that who we thought was a good suspect was her boss, who used to follow her home like every night, which was very odd. And
can you talk a little bit more about that, about what he did that was odd, or how you came to suspect him?
It was kind of the entire process. Mom decided she wanted to start working. She went and applied at a job where she had very little. She had no experience. There were, I think, 7 or 8 other women that were going for that position that did have experience, and somehow she was given the job instead of these other applicants. Now, Mom was she was a pretty attractive girl, and she kept asking my grandmother, her mother, that she didn't know why she was hired, really, because she certainly wasn't the most qualified person for the job. Shortly after she started, her boss followed her home every night, and she actually asked him, "Why are you following me home?" And he just said that he wanted to make sure that she got home okay. And she'd actually said that to my grandmother. She talked to my grandmother nearly every night, and she told her about it and said, "Yeah, he said he wants to make sure that I get home okay." And it wasn't more than a couple of weeks later she was dead. So,
and you mentioned earlier when there's a murder like this, the people closest to the victim, whether it's spouses or other people in the family or coworkers, those are the people that they look at first and work their way out from there. So it would only make sense that they should have questioned him.
No doubt about it. But it's very hard to find that in the file. I've tried to go through it as best I can. They've given me some access to some of the information, and I did try to find that. I really wanted to create like my own little list of here's who was questioned and cleared and why they were cleared, and you can just kind of run down the list. But you're exactly right. It's usually someone that's close to especially when it's quote a crime of passion. It was a pretty violent scene, and that's personal. That's usually someone closer to the victim. So.
It sounds like you've really put effort into working on your mom's case, and it always amazes me when I talk to so many people that become sort of citizen detectives that are working a family member's case and trying to do some police work on their own with it. How much time have you spent and what kind of efforts have you put in trying to learn more and figure out what happened to her?
It's strange. It kind of goes in waves. You get a little bit of an energy boost when something comes up and it piques your curiosity, or someone comes forward and gives you information, and all of a sudden it's like there's a resurgence of the efforts. So yeah, but I on the flip side of that, I'm always surprised when people just kind of say, well, I'm at peace with it, and they're fine with not knowing the truth, and that is not me. I've wanted to find out exactly what went on, and it's tough because you don't get a lot of help from law enforcement. I mean, a lot of times you can't get any of that type of information that would make the job a lot easier. No, I've just spent some. It's been cyclical as far as the time that I spend on some things. It's difficult, having just a regular job and trying to do that too. And but small town. I mean, everybody knew her murder. When they find out who you are, all of a sudden, each person has their own little hypothesis of what went on, and you'll talk to somebody and they'll give you a new angle to look at, and the least you can do is to explore it. No stone left unturned.
And you mentioned the coworker that drove your dad home, going to his house and his wife remembering you all those years later. Was it sort of ingrained into the neighborhood's memory after that? Was that like an infamous case there that they talked about for years after? Do you know?
Oh, yeah, no question. I still meet people. A year doesn't go by where I don't at least meet one or two people where I'll, tell them my name, and they kind of look at you a little funny, and they, where are you from, and who was your mom and dad? So they'll kind of, it's very well remembered, especially of, with people that are over, say 60, 65. I went to, it's a long story, but the long and the short is that I went to a funeral home to look at a suspect that had passed, and wanted to just kind of see him and see if something about his face would trigger something in my head. And when I went there, he had not come from being prepared for the service. It was the day before his actual viewing. And she was the only one at the funeral home. Kept saying how it was very odd that she was left there by herself. And eventually, when we were talking, she had asked, I mentioned that both my parents had passed, told her that my father was killed in a motorcycle wreck, gave her his name. And then she asked about Mom. And I said, well, she was actually murdered here in Springfield. Her name was Anita Taylor. And she kind of freaked out a little bit and looked at me, and she said, where'd that happen? And I said, here in Springfield. And she said, no, what street? And I said, it happened on Ludlow Avenue. And she gave me the address. She said, 415 Ludlow Avenue. And that was, again, 50 years ago. And I said, yes. And what was even stranger is she said, honey, I was the lady that moved out of that house when your parents moved in. Wow. So she actually was, just the oddball chances of that happening, of running into that person. I'd love to know what the odds are of that, but that seems to go on all the time in my life, where I'll just meet people that either worked with Dad or lived down the street from where it happened.
Wow. And you touched on something interesting. You said you went to that funeral to look at that suspect and just see if it triggered anything into you. I know that you went through hypnosis at some point in an effort to see if by some miracle you could, somehow come up with some kind of memories about your mom's killer. Can you tell us a little bit about that process and what, if anything, that did provide?
The hypnosis?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was, I mean, I'm guardedly optimistic and somewhat skeptical about that type of thing. So if going into it, I thought, again, one of those things that just give it a shot. You never know. You have to try. And so I really wasn't putting too much credence into the whole process, and kind of just one of those relaxation things. And I did remember some things that came back in like flashes. It was like pictures, like you would open your eyes real quick and then close them, and it would just be that image real quick in your mind. So I remember a few things. I mean, it was a little odd. I remember clothes being folded and clothes being on the floor. I remember seeing my own feet, like I was being pushed in a cart or something. I remember seeing my feet. I remember feeling heat on the side of my face. That's roughly when I woke up. I mean, it kind of came out of it, if you will. Thought it took about 20 minutes. It was I can't remember, hour and a half, something like that. I thought it was just a few minutes, and then we'd gone for hours. So it was very odd, and certainly the loss in time was something that made me think, all right, well, maybe there's something to this. But yeah, I just received a couple of the flashes, and nothing useful other than that.
Nothing as far as like a smoking gun, a person's face or anything like that.
Yeah, exactly. That's why I went to the funeral. You never know. You watch too many movies where all of a sudden this person has this epiphany where it's like, oh my gosh, that's, now I remember everything. Well, maybe that'll happen. Who knows? So I thought I'd give it a go. But nothing on that.
And how rough was this on your family after the murder? Obviously this caused splintered. Here's your dad, and his wife's murdered, and obviously it's going to be a new thing for him to deal with. But we talked a little bit before we started recording about the way there's a ripple effect or a butterfly effect of one thing like this happening changes so many lives. How did that affect your family after the murder?
Well, I can say that from my grandmother's perspective, she was fairly religious prior to the murder, and I don't think she was ever in a church after that, other than for weddings and funerals. That was about it. So she certainly kind of lost her faith after Mom's murder. Definitely less trusting. To be honest, she was almost institutionalized. She just absolutely lost her mind, just because of how violent it was. I mean, it had to be it was a closed casket. It was very rough. And probably raising me is what helped her kind of focus instead of just wallowing in, the memory of what had happened. She had a reason to keep going. So, every room was like a little mini shrine to Mom's memory. So it was a little weird growing up. There was just pictures everywhere, and there was never a time when I didn't know what happened. I can't remember ever wondering what happened to my mom. I always knew. I mean, from the time I have a memory, my grandmother told me exactly what had gone on. But yeah, other family members definitely kind of stepping up and trying to take on different. I don't think it was ever explicitly said or discussed. It was just something that happened where I had different family members that all played a kind of a different role in kind of my upbringing. So it's very strange. I don't know anything different, but it was it's certainly one of those things that wasn't talked about much, and if it was brief, because everybody in the family would just kind of a lot of crying going on, and then we would change the subject, that's for sure.
And you mentioned you knew what happened, but you never really talked about it. But I assume at some point, naturally, as a kid, you start to want to ask questions. Did that happen for you? And if so, when?
Yeah, it did happen. It was pretty early too. I was probably second or third grade, maybe. So I was probably maybe 8 years old. And I knew that asking my grandmother was not that's not going to end well. So I knew she had cedar chest, which was like, I don't think people do it nowadays. But back in the day, they called them hope chests or whatever. And it was like a big trunk, and all kinds of stuff in there. Well, my grandmother was getting something out of there one day, and she happened to open it, and I saw these newspaper clippings, and I thought, okay, well, that's where the mother lode is. I'll wait until I can just get in there unknown to her, and I'll just read. And that's really how I did it. All the information that I received was predominantly through those newspaper articles that I found in her cedar chest. So word of mouth became a little bit more prevalent later on, but when I was a kid, I didn't really want to bring it up because it wasn't an easy thing for her to talk about. So I really found all of my information from those articles.
And at some point you moved on to wanting to do more than read articles. I guess you went looking and searching for answers and questioning people and looking at people at a funeral home just to see if they trigger anything. What age did you do that when you started to really look into the case and put a lot of time in doing that?
It's funny. It's one of those things you never, obviously you think about it every single day. There's not a day that goes by that you don't. But the funny thing was, after I got my driver's license, it was probably less than, I would say, 2 weeks after I got my driver's license. That was one of the first places I went, was the police department, and asked if it was possible to see the evidence from the case. Which at that point they didn't allow me to do it. I was 16 years old, so I'm sure that has something to do with it. But yeah, so it's been ongoing. You kind of get caught up in your own, formative years between 18 and 22, trying to get through college and start a career and all that fun stuff. So I'd say that in earnest, probably when I was 20, maybe 25, things started to kick back in. But from the time I've been able to drive, I was asking questions.
And as far as the relationship you have today with investigators, here we are 50 years out. Do you have a dialogue now with them? Are they willing to share stuff with you or talk to you about the case?
They've been cordial, I guess is the easiest way to put it. They don't really provide me with much information. At one point they told us that they'd actually received DNA hits from the evidence. They were able to test it, and they were able to tell that it wasn't my father. We found out not long after that was completely fabricated, because there was a news broadcast that was being done, and the person doing the news broadcast said, in short, you've had 40 years to do this. You've got 2 weeks. And so, the concept was they didn't want to be looked at as not helping out, not being forthcoming in assisting in the investigation. So they just said, yeah, we tested it, and it came back, it wasn't Larry Taylor. And I thought, well, if you tested it, that's fantastic. I really don't care about who it wasn't. I care about who it is. And wouldn't stop calling. Found out later that it actually had never been tested. They never even ran the DNA on it. So
wow.
Took years to get that done. And now we're back to the point where, they're actually, apparently there is a DNA sample somewhere, a partial DNA print from the crime scene. So it's just a lot of, not much work gets done on it, to be honest. I mean, they're nice enough to talk to, but as far as activity, it's really not there.
I think that's very common, and unfortunately in some of these cases that are 30, 40, 50 years old,
sure,
there are fresher, newer cases to solve. Not that the older ones aren't just as important, but I think in their minds, these are more solvable. There's an immediate need there, which is, unfortunate for people like you that have been looking for answers for all these years. But I think one good thing is we see what's going on with DNA, that we see that people from decades ago are being identified. So hopefully that can happen in your mom's case. Do you know if there's enough DNA or if they've got the right kind of sample to do genetic genealogy? Have they talked to that aspect at all with you?
They have not. So that's kind of the next step. I'm now trying to find out who's in charge of that. They did have two individuals that were working a cold case division or unit. I think both of those individuals have moved on to other positions now. So to my knowledge, there's no one actively working on it. But yeah, I don't know whether or not there's enough of a DNA sample to do some type of a genetic test.
Oh, fingers crossed. Hopefully that's something that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Or with new advances, maybe they'll be able to do something down the line. And is it your hope after all this time that the killer, if he's alive, goes to prison, or is it just that you want to know, even if they're dead, what is it that you're seeking, to have some kind of, not closure, that's not the right word, but to have some kind of peace?
Yeah, I sometimes laugh at the word closure because it's like, there's no such thing. I mean, it just doesn't, it's not going to change anything. But knowing, I'm not as concerned about someone going to prison and paying their debt to society or any of that that nature. It's just I think I'd like to know, and I know the family members would be, I think that would be a sigh of relief for them, where it's just kind of like, okay, now we've got that taken care of. We've found out what happened, why it happened, and who did it. We can move on. So yeah, I'm more concerned about just knowing.
Yeah. And obviously, because you were so young, you've missed the entire life you would have had with your mom in it. And I guess anything that you know about her, that you've been able to learn about her, has come from other people and other sources. But based on all of that, what kind of woman was your mom? And is there anything you could tell us about some of the things you found out about her? Any special stories or anything about her?
Not a whole lot. The main thing that I remember is kind of that she was fairly kind of shy in high school. And then after having, right around about the time that she had me, things started to change. I mean, she was starting to become a lot more confident, outgoing. She started going to college in Elkhart, Indiana, right out of high school. She was only 20 when she was killed. She was a month from her 21st birthday, so she was very young. There's an entire life of growing up and learning and living that she never got to experience. So, but yeah, it sounded like she was just kind of coming into that part of her life where she was really starting to change and to blossom, and that was all cut short.
And somebody stole that away from her and the rest of your family.
Yeah, no question.
So you've had this website set up that's called TaylorCase.com, dedicated to your mom's memory and the search for her killer. What kind of effort did you put into putting that up? And I think we briefly touched on it. You do get some tips every once in a while that come in, but what is the main focus of that website?
Really just a repository of information. If people want to go out and take a look at what we have as evidence or what we've been able to find from the case and put it on the website, ideas that they might have. The big thing is Springfield wasn't a big town, still not a big town. And really she grew up in an even smaller town. Ironically, I went to the same high school that she did. I graduated from the same high school that she graduated from almost 20 years to the day when she did. So I went to school with a lot of her classmates, kids. So that was very, very strange. And it's a small town. And so the website, in part, was kind of like that small town. People talk, you hear things, and if you wanted a place where you could safely go out there and say, "Hey, this is something that we'd always thought about, or people had always talked about in the town. Have you ever looked at this or talked to this person?" So it was it was just a way for people to get and give information about her case, because it was a very small town, and I think there were a lot of people that had ideas about what had happened.
And hopefully, if anybody listening to this hears it and knows about the case, they'll come visit the website, especially if they have information. Is there a tip line or anything like that people can call that you know offhand?
There's the Springfield Police Department. I don't have the number. The direct number for one of their divisions is 937-324-7707. And that's the general number for Springfield Police Department. I do have an email link on the TaylorCase.com website, so people are more than able to leave us a message, and we always respond to those very quickly. So
hopefully, if anybody does have any information, they'll come forward. Well, it sounds like you've really put a large effort into, not letting your mom be forgotten, and to not letting the person that committed this heinous act go unnoticed. You're continuing to dig. I think your mom would probably be really proud of you for that.
I appreciate it. I hope so.
Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of The Murder of My Family. I'd like to thank Debbie Buck at TrueCrimeDiva.com for writing and research assistance in this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please introduce a friend of the podcast and invite them to listen. As we wrap up this episode, I'd like to invite you to listen to a preview of a new true crime podcast that I think you'll really enjoy. It's called Apple for the Teacher. Be sure to give it a listen. And before you go, remember that every murder victim means something to somebody.
Hello everyone. Let me tell you about the Apple for the Teacher podcast. I'm Anna Thomas, a teacher and your host. So you're probably thinking it's about reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? Well, think again. It's a fresh take on true crime, where you wouldn't expect to find true crime. In schools. Yes, schools. You will hear tragic and shocking stories that I have uncovered in my own profession. You'll hear about murder, abduction, hijack, misconduct, student disappearance, suicide, kidnap and ransom, and much, much more. So if you're looking for something a little different in the true crime genre, then Apple for the Teacher is for you. You can find the podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. So join me as I present People Behaving Badly, the Bad Apples. Looking forward to seeing you soon. But until then, remember to be a good apple.